From Software's approach to storytelling in the first rendition of Dark Souls is an exercise in invitation rather than imposition. There are a few context-setting moments, such as the cutscenes, but the bulk of the world's history and motive drive lies in the places you would actively have to seek out. Each location has its own reason for existing, with stories of their own that can be found in the enemies, item placements, architecture, stillness of the air, and most obviously, the boss of that area. The world's geometry and set dressing tell you what Gwyn tore what from whom, and what was sacred and what was banished. That information is legible if you pay attention to the finer details, but it is never presented as a standardized lecture, something you absolutely have to know in order to enjoy Dark Souls. From Software takes great pride in their item descriptions, despite them being a second channel of storytelling that speaks only to those who want to listen. Weapons and armor have short paragraphs about the previous knights, witches, hollows, kings, and so on, and some even have their old uses or Lordran-specific historical context. However, if one presses X, you can skip over that text dump entirely to a newer, more complex screen consisting of damage and status resist numbers, durability numbers, and the overall tone becomes much more removed from the act of wanting to understand why the Moonlight Robe claims Gwendolyn was raised as a daughter. This separation via the X button, if you're on Xbox, is found in every single item that enters the player's inventory, aside from key items and, well, keys. And probably some other things, but I can't quite remember off the top of my head. However, that separation of want and need to know turns lore into a discoverable artifact. If you never open the details, you can still swing the Zweihander and be perfectly aligned with the game's mechanical goals. The entire plotline of Dark Souls sits on a different plane of existence, which can keep the storytelling optional and somewhat intimate. NPCs in the first Dark Souls are spatially optional in a way most modern linear games are not. The characters don't appear from lifts and hand you an ever so important quest. Instead, you will often find NPCs in offshoots of the intended path, or behind an optional shortcut, or sometimes you can find fair ladies behind a wall that blends in shockingly well with its environment. Some of them, like Solaire, move as bosses fall, which creates questlines that can be missed entirely if you never go looking for them. From Software's choice to present their NPCs in this way preserves the purity of the main path for players who want a focused, strictly combat experience, and it offers a secondary exploratory mode for players who like the, well, exploration of consequence. If you want to learn Solaire's story or the fate of Siegmeyer, you must seek out the two of them and play the game in such a way that doesn't detriment their quests, and then ultimately find out by yourself what becomes of them, because From Software will not hand it to you, despite Dark Souls' rich story. However, if you don't seek the fate of onions or the sun, the game remains entirely playable. Your mechanical goals are unchanged, and you will reach the end just the same as those who thrive in the lore. Like I mentioned briefly before with the X button, controls and interface quietly support this mode of optional storytelling. The confirm or interact button advances dialogue and is how you engage with NPC speech. Another button is used to use items or to open more details about them in the inventory. And the start or select button can skip cinematics entirely. From Software puts the narrative interaction on the same axis as typical player choice. You press a button to talk, and you can press that same button to skip. You highlight an item in your inventory to see its most important numbers, and then you can press a button to flip the GUI to text, only if you would like to read it. But then outside of that text, Dark Souls will make very little effort to explain that said item for you. The physical act of advancing or skipping dialogue, pressing a single button to fly through the text, turns Dark Souls into a basically player-controlled filter over narrative input. The player is placed in the role of historian or hard-headed brute, Dark Souls' minimal exposition is a deliberate invitation to interpretation, something that allows such powerhouses as Vatividya to bestow the knowledge of the concrete lore onto you at a later time in a way that is simple to understand and easy to digest. What you do not see becomes just as important as what you do. Whether or not you know why Gwyn sealed himself away to start with is literally not important in any way. You will still reach the kiln and Gwyn will still be standing there, hollow as ever. I think this is partly because the plot is not shouted at you. From Software seeded the game with enough concrete facts to anchor the conversation, but so much of the interpretation is left to community. It's left to those who read the item text and link it to a point in the world, and the community who notices an NPC move from place to place, and people like the wonderful Smowtown who decipher the cryptic lines about ONS and can deliver it to the players who, to put it nicely, didn't care for it during their playthrough. The story of Dark Souls will always remain fixed, but also the story of Dark Souls varies depending on who one might ask. In practice, Dark Souls' narrative strategy turns a single-player game into this multiplayer of ideas. Different players will find different threads on different playthroughs, and all of these are not tricks, but deliberate design choices to keep the story vivid without making it compulsory. Without a omniscient narrator, players must fill that role themselves. We stitch together the story from the first-hand clues that From Software leaves in its concrete facts, and the gaps we fill are often projection. We bring our own moral logic to Gwyn's act, to his choice to eradicate the everlasting dragons, and to the ethics of survival in a decaying economy of the flame. Community togetherness via understanding story plays to one of Dark Souls' strengths: ambiguity. That ambiguity is exactly what encourages debates, essays, and has allowed people like Hawkshaw, for example, to have entire careers, because the narrative is not merely consumed, it remains alive in the people who can educate. As players assemble the lore, communities become laboratories. One player will read an item, notice a boss's posture, and post about it on a forum or make a video. Other players will then flock to that laboratory and will test the theory against other descriptions that they themselves have discovered on their own terms. And over time, a consensus emerges around certain interpretations while other possibilities remain open just the same. From Software scaffolds Dark Souls, and the community constructs Dark Souls. And I think that is one of the reasons why Dark Souls will never die. You can skip, you can speed through, you can ignore item descriptions, you can kill every NPC on your first meeting, you can ignore every unique enemy, you can play the game on mute, and Dark Souls will still function just as intended. What you miss at most is a layer of emotional resonance and explanation. And even then, that's putting it at its absolute simplest terms. Dark Souls treats lore as enrichment rather than the absolute pure scaffolding that is holding the entire game up. Do not get me wrong, the optional nature of Dark Souls does not mean it is a shallow game. When Crestfallen offers you a single weary line about the two bells, that sentence is incredibly potent precisely because it is rare. Dark Souls and its absence of constant narrative commentary forces players to listen closely when text or tone appears, and that attention makes the occasional reveals land much harder. In a world where most things are deathly silent, a single sentence or voiced line about the betrayal, about the duty, about the right, about the mystery becomes memorable. It's important to be very precise about what the game gives you and what it leaves to the player. Dark Souls has an incredibly strong framework. The First Flame, the Age of Fire, the Four Lords, the structure of Lordran as a kingdom, the chosen undead, and the pilgrimage of the undead asylum, the fate of dragons, the sad tales of the firekeepers, the sad tale of Gwyn, and the player's agency to sustain the age or end the age. And that framework is not flexible in the sense of variable canon. However, From Software trusts players to care enough for both that framework, but also to go looking for the rest of the framework that doesn't sit as strong as something like Gwyn does. Miyazaki's trust in his player base is a radical move in an industry that often equates accessibility with spoon feeding. Rather than offering a narrator who explains motives, Miyazaki gives you witnesses and travelers from other nations like Astura. In the world of Lordran, the truth is scattered and tarnished and half burned, half forgotten, half miserable, half might as well not exist. And so, it makes perfect sense that not everybody who picks up the controller will uncover it, because a player who doesn't care about that mystery can still enjoy navigating the ruined Onolondo and defeating the boss without ever once opening the item GUI. Dark Souls support both experiences without diminishing either. When fewer words are given, every word gains weight. And that, unquestionably, is Dark Souls. Until next time, something about the sun, I think? Asvati, I don't know.
Don't you dare let yourself go hollow, lest my time spent on you be wasted.